Thank you, Lee, for your presentation. So now I'm going to focus on some of the key tissue and fluid outputs from the actual SOZO device. I have around about 15 years experience now really working with a range of different body composition technologies. I've done thousands of measurements with patients, with elite athletes, with just general population. And I think it's how we actually interpret the information firstly, but then secondly, deliver that message to a patient that is really powerful if we want to make sure they can achieve the goals that we're setting for them and really make some changes. So where do we begin? There's so many outputs that are available. Ordinarily, we've only really got weight and sometimes, you know, the BMI aspect, but then we bring in fluid, we bring in muscle, we're bringing in things like phase angle, some of the metabolically typed outputs as well, basal metabolic rate, things like that. So where do we start? For me, it's really all about the patient. So which outputs will have the biggest impact on the outcome for my patient? We know that SOZO will provide instant feedback for the health professional and also the patient. And we know that can improve compliance more often than not. So if you're trying to implement some change around exercise, nutrition, or whatever the circumstance is, the instant feedback and the ability to quickly see these changes is really valuable for a patient to hear. And that's motivating. And I know Lee mentioned it before about the motivation side of using body composition assessment. But how do we want to explain those results to my patients? Do I want to use kilos, which is really tangible? So do I want to pick up a 20 kilo weight plate and say, hey, you've got 25 kilos or 20 kilos of muscle mass. How do we make it to 25 kilos? Or do we want to use percentage, which sometimes be very valuable and a great way to explain the results? Do I want to look at the original result, so from change from the baseline, or do I want to look at just the previous measurement? They're all things that I need to consider before I actually provide the right information to my patient. Which outputs line up with the patient's goal? That's what I'm looking for, and that really gives me the trigger to deliver the right message. So a little bit of body composition 101. Pre-test protocol is really important. If you have got access to SOZO, it does give you some recommendations before you take a measurement. But things like no high amounts of alcohol, at least 12 hours before, no exercise 4 to 6 hours before, no high amounts of caffeine, no large meal, you know, making sure they're in a voided state to get them to go to the toilet, because we want to try and establish as good as possible a standard level of fluid for that particular patient. So when we do a retest, they're in the same typical fluid status. We just learned from Lee how the technology works, measuring fluid, so that's why it's so critical. I often get asked, how often should I take a tissue and fluid measurement? Depending on the patient, we don't certainly want to be taking measurements every single week because we won't see a significant change. But every month, 6 weeks, even up to a 3-month period tends to show change over time. And trend over time, or change over time, as I've discussed, is the most important element. If I do one measurement, it gives me a little bit of information. 2 gives me a bit more, but 3 really gives me the trend that I'm looking for, and has there been any significant changes with those outputs. Establishing a baseline is important. So is that from the very first time you see your patient, or do you want to start a baseline from when their treatment has begun or an exercise program has begun, any nutritional changes? So thinking about when you want to establish a baseline. And then reference ranges are useful, yes, but only useful if they're going to really benefit you as the clinician and or the patient. And I always use the example of, you know, if you've got a 50% body fat individual, the reference range of say 15 to 25% for that particular person is kind of irrelevant. So use that to your advantage. Little steps from 50% to 45% to 40% is much more powerful than looking at a reference range. So what are the key SOZO outputs? I think there's 5, you know, and they're based in 3 different areas. So fluid, muscle, and fat. Fluid, we really look at total body water, extracellular fluid, and intracellular fluid. Muscle is skeletal muscle mass, and fat mass is the one that everyone loves, or maybe not so much, is fat mass itself, or FM. The thing to remember with all of these 5 key outputs is they all work together. We understand how the technology works, so the fluid component is really important. So don't ever just look at fat mass as an example on its own. We need to see what's happening with the other parameters to really establish an holistic view of the patient and what's occurred with that patient from test to test. So let's look at some of those fluid outputs. Total body water is a combination of intracellular and extracellular fluid. It can be expressed as litres and pints and or percentage. Generally, percentage is a great way to interpret total body water. We know sometimes females have a slightly lower total body water percentage than males, and also muscle contains a lot more water than fat. So if you're testing someone in the obese population, you may tend to find their total body water percentage is a lot lower than some of the other normal subjects that you are assessing. Extracellular fluid is a great thing to be looking at. I know we spend a lot of time looking at that for the lymphedema side, but it really contains all the fluid outside the body. It includes blood and interstitial fluid. It's expressed as litres and pints and percentage again, but any excess extracellular fluid can be indicative of disease potentially. We know of early stage lymphedema, other nutritional imbalances, and heart failure. So looking at that in conjunction with total body water is actually really quite useful, as well as intracellular fluid, so everything inside your cells. Again, litres, pints, or percentage, depending on what you're trying to deliver to the patient is the message. Often changes in intracellular fluid are a result of an increase or decrease in some muscle mass. Because it's a metabolically active tissue muscle, intracellular fluid is a big component of that. So you will see some changes if muscle mass has increased or decreased. That leads me into skeletal muscle mass, one of the big outputs from the SOZO device, expressed as kilos, pounds, or percentage. Now, there's no specific reference range for skeletal muscle mass, so trend over time is really important, but this is where how you deliver the message to a patient can be really powerful. Again, if I use that 20 kilo weight plate example, I can say, hey, how do we find a way to go from 20 kilos to 25 to 30 kilos? So small increments of change in skeletal muscle mass can make a huge impact to the quality of the life of the patient, the ability of them to even physically get up out of a chair if it's an elderly person, or beyond that if it's a more of a healthy individual as well. So a great output to really focus in on. And then we have fat mass, the one that everyone loves to hate. The image there is a half a kilo, about a pound of body fat. It's a lot when you're trying to carry that around. Again, kilos and percent, depending on how you want to deliver that message, quite often percentage is something that really people focus in on. But again, that tangibility is important. So quite often I'll pick up that 20 kilo weight plate and say, hey, we've got 20 kilos of body fat. Now, we don't want to lose all of that. Maybe we want to get it down to 15. So how do we find a way to get down 5 kilos of body fat, as an example? There are reference ranges available across various demographics. So reach out to us if you need some help interpreting those. They are very different from, country to country. But trend over time, again, with all of these outputs is really important. So they're the top 5 parameters. If you can get a handle on those and understand those, whether you're a lymphedema therapist, exercise physiologist, radiation oncologist, you can have a fantastic multidisciplinary team conversation around some of these parameters. So the additional outputs from SOZO, phase angle, quite a technical output, and certainly if you've got some questions at the end, I know Lee was more than happy to answer some of those around phase angle, but essentially it's the angle between measured impedance and the measured pure resistance. So Adam, what does that mean? Well, maybe it's a really good indicator of cell function. We know it's expressed as degrees. Reference ranges are often reported somewhere between 3 and 10 degrees. And with the thousands of measurements that I've done, I've actually tested people that have been very close to 10. Likewise, on the other end of the scale, right down around that 3 to 4 level. Changes over time become really important. If there's been some significant changes with disease state, quite often phase angle will decrease. And as people recover, it can certainly be shown to be increasing as well. So a great output to understand and use when you need it to for your patients. We also have HIDEX, so that's an index created by PetiMed. It's a relative, kind of index that really looks at a healthy population and compares that person that you've tested to that population using things like age and gender and height and weight. Essentially, if you're less hydrated, it shows up in the negative side, in that light blue side. If you're more hydrated, it shows up in the darker blue side. But it's based around standard deviation. So a reading of somewhere between -25 and +25 is typically one standard deviation. Change over time again, or trend over time, is the way to use HIDEX. If there's been any significant changes to HIDEX, I then go back and look at things like total body water, intracellular, extracellular fluid, and try and find out what's happened from a fluid perspective from the previous measurement. So it can be really invaluable to give you a quick snapshot of what's happening with that patient. Some further additional SOZO outputs are active tissue mass and extracellular mass. I love to share these with patients. So active tissue mass, I can say, hey, look, this is all the good stuff, all the stuff we want to keep and hold on to. So our metabolically active tissue includes muscle, intracellular fluid, organs, ICF, all of that good stuff. So whatever treatment, whatever we're doing, we want to hold on to that. Extracellular mass is everything else around bones and minerals and extracellular fluid, including blood plasma. So we don't see as much change, but certainly active tissue mass is a great one to really pinpoint with patients and hopefully track and trend over time. And then the final two outputs really that are available are basal metabolic rate and protein and minerals. So basal metabolic rate, or BMR, is really, if I laid on this bed behind me for 24 hours and didn't do anything, that's kind of the amount of energy I'd burn. Nutritionally, it's used a lot through the dietetic departments and nutritionists. They also add things in like, how active is your lifestyle? Do you sit behind the desk all day, or are you out, working, on a more high intense job? They will build the amount of calories that you need, plus the exercise that you're doing. So it becomes a big component of taking the SOZO measurement to that next level, if that is in your area of expertise. So generally in the nutrition side. Protein and mineral content is fat-free mass, so that's everything except body fat minus total body water, and that equals our protein and mineral. So again, that gets used very much in that nutritional side, sometimes in the renal space as well. Looking at a number without fluid is really important to make some assumptions on your patients. So in summary, for me, it's all about the patient. We've looked at ways to interpret that information. So making sure you're getting the right information across can make a big difference to the outcome if that patient really buys into what you're suggesting and the changes that you're making, across the exercise side, or whether it's from a nutrition perspective, or whatever the issue is. Sharing SOZO outputs across a multidisciplinary team may also assist achieve the best possible patient care. So don't be afraid to be doing that within your teams, and really educating as a group around some of those key parameters, fat mass, skeletal muscle mass, total body water, intracellular, extracellular fluid. Everyone on your team has a really good understanding of those things. It's a great way to move forward with your patients. Making sure and remembering that all of those tissue and fluid outputs are linked, so not just looking at something like body fat percentage, and also looking at trend over time is the most important thing. So what's happening from a test to test period? Is it trending in the right direction? Are things working? Do I need to change things? Do I need to change the program? Do I need to change the nutrition? That is the best way to use the technology. So thank you for your time. I'll now hand over to Joanna, who will then look at some of those outputs from her clinical perspective. And thank you very much.